Welcome to Agri-Pulse Newsmakers, where we aim to take you to the heart of ag policy. I'm your host, Andrew Hunnicky. This week's guest is John Newton, the executive head of terrain agriculture and former Republican chief economist for the Senate Ag Committee. He joins us to talk about their new report on disaster relief and this year's economic outlook for agriculture. But first, here are this week's headlines. Congressional Republican leaders are trying to get off to a fast start on President-elect Donald Trump's agenda. But first, they are debating the best way to move his legislative priorities through Congress. House GOP leaders think that the best way to make sure these priorities become law is to throw everything into one bill, including tax and spending cuts and border security funding. But GOP leaders fear such a big bill would collapse on its own weight. President Trump said at a news conference he's okay with either approach. Dock workers and their employers avoided a strike at East and Gulf Coast ports Wednesday evening after reaching a tentative agreement on a new contract. The International Longshoremen's Association, which represents union dock workers in the labor discussions, and the U.S. Maritime Alliance said that the two parties agreed to all items on the 6-year contract. The union called a strike in October when the previous contract expired. Workers returned to work 3 days later after the two parties settled on wage increases and an agreement to extend the master contract until January 15th to resolve outstanding issues. Automation remained a sticking point in the ongoing talks as workers looked for assurance that their jobs would not be replaced by new port technologies. Meanwhile, the government is struggling to contain the ongoing outbreak of avian flu in both dairy cattle and poultry operations. A 65-year-old in Louisiana has died after getting the virus, with the likely source being infected poultry and wild birds. The CDC says the risk to humans remains low. But the Department of Health and Human Services awarded more than $300 million worth of funding towards bird flu preparedness and monitoring. At the same time, USDA is increasing a bulk milk testing program to try and find where the virus exists and decrease the risk of it spreading to other livestock. USDA says 919 dairy herds have been infected in 16 states. According to the United Egg Producers, the industry lost 40 million birds last year. Finally, USDA has received $31 billion from Congress to help farmers survive weather-related disasters, as well as the downturn in commodity markets last year. We asked John Newton how much money farmers are going to get.
In our analysis that we've done, that we just posted on the website, farmers are expected to get close to $10 billion, about $9.8 billion in payments. Corn producers are expected to receive about $3.8 billion with an average program payment of $43 an acre. Soybean producers should expect to receive about $2.5 billion with an average program payment of $29 an acre. The highest program payment is expected for cotton producers at nearly $90 an acre, but representing only about $1 billion of that $10 billion in farmer assistance relief that's going out the door.
Let's talk about the money from the 2024 crops that were lost. Are those payments going to be enough to keep farmers from losing money on those 2024 crops?
Oh, that's the challenge, right? Because the payments only represent about 26% of the difference between the cost of production and the revenue estimate. And so when you look at those program payments and you line it up with 2024 margins, or even 2025 margins for that case, it's still going to be a pretty tight year, even in light of expectations for higher ARC and PLC guarantees. Margins are still going to be pretty tight in 2025 for crop producers.
There's also $21 billion in disaster aid in the American Relief Act that Congress passed in December. Who's going to benefit the most from that assistance?
That one's probably a little more uncertain at this point because Congress wasn't as prescriptive in how to deliver the relief for natural disasters. I think a lot of folks think this is going to mirror what we saw in the wildfire hurricane indemnity program or the emergency relief program, in that the natural disaster relief will almost be a top-up on crop insurance. It will play in that deductible space for crop insurance like we've seen in the past, but it will certainly help producers that have been devastated by catastrophic natural disasters.
We'll be back with more from John Newton right after this.
These are the farmers and ranchers who help build the America we depend on, and Farm Credit is here for them, supporting rural communities and agriculture with reliable, consistent credit and financial services. In good times and bad, we provide loans to farmers and ranchers, farmer-owned cooperatives, rural home buyers, agribusinesses, and rural infrastructure providers. We help agricultural producers feed the world. Learn more today.
I think some of sustainability to farmers just comes second nature. If you asked a farmer, are you sustainable? They'd probably look at you maybe a little funny and say, I don't think I'm doing anything that special, but it really is just what they do. We're all farmers, and our goal is taking the best care of our land, our cattle, our natural resources.
This is my sustainability story.
Don't miss the must-attend policy event of the year. Register now for the 2025 Agri-Pulse Ag and Food Policy Summit. Hear from the diverse players who are trying to navigate taxes, trade, and technology as we dive into what's ahead for food and agriculture. The summit takes place on Monday, March 17th at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. and through our virtual experience. View the agenda and register today under the Events tab at agripulse.com.
Welcome back. We asked John Newton about the ag economic outlook for 2025, including the future of commodity prices and input costs.
Well, we've seen corn prices rally over the last few weeks. I mean, corn demand has been fairly strong to start the crop year. We've seen stocks come down, so I think that's positive. There's still a lot of uncertainty on what demand's going to look like for soybeans. That's weighed on prices a little bit. I think we still see some headwinds in some of our other major crops. And then on the input side, some inputs have kind of stabilized, some input costs, but other things are continuing to go up. Labor expenses are going up. We saw the change in the adverse effect wage rate. Taxes are potentially going to go up. A lot depends on what happens in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act and the reconciliation package that Congress will ultimately consider. But we're still in an environment where margins are expected to be pretty tight in 2025.
President-elect Trump continuing to insist this week he's going to carry out his plan to impose the across-the-board tariffs on imports. He's also threatened higher tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico. Are you worried that there could be a new trade war that would drive down those commodity prices?
Well, I think the most important things for folks to recognize and acknowledge is that nominee Ms. Rollins for USDA secretary is going to go through. She's already meeting with members in the Senate. She's going to go through a hearing process in the Senate. She needs to get in that seat and have an opportunity to stand in the Oval Office and talk to the president on how potential tariffs, retaliation in response to those tariffs could impact agriculture. That's the most important thing across the board for all of agriculture, beyond just tariffs, is having a strong ambassador in the room for U.S. agriculture. And I think we have that in Secretary nominee Rollins.
Before we wrap, you do have another important report coming out soon to focus on long-term demand for U.S. agricultural exports. Could you share some more information on that upcoming report with our viewers?
Well, I think for a long time, U.S. agriculture has been of the mind that we need to produce more. There's a growing population around the world. We need to feed 10 billion by 2050. But the reality is, and we've got an upcoming report from Terrain, that paradigm has shifted. And when you think about where we do business, where U.S. agriculture does business, China, Japan, South Korea, the European Union, all of those markets are already in a state of population decline. There are fewer mouths to feed in those markets now and moving forward. And that flies in the face of what agriculture is traditionally aimed for, which is producing more food for a growing population. We're going to dive into that at Terrain.
What are the implications of your upcoming report for all of the U.S. groups that are focused on agricultural exports?
Well, I think the implications are we need to be recognizing that there's a paradigm shift, and in the markets where we do business, the population's declining. That has implications on food consumption. That has implications on population age. So many trickle-down effects will impact agriculture, and that's what we're going to look at Terrain.
John Newton, thank you so much for making some time and joining us this morning, sir.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
We'll be back with our panel discussion, but first, Lydia Johnson has a look at bird flu infections in dairy cattle and poultry in this week's Ag by the Numbers.
A recent surge of bird flu cases in dairy cattle and the first death of a person from the virus have refocused national attention on the outbreak. The federal government has increased response spending, including over $300 million from the Department of Health and Human Services, to increase monitoring of people exposed to infected animals, testing capabilities, and outreach to high-risk populations, including livestock workers. As you can see on this chart, the first case of bird flu in dairy cattle was identified in March 2024, with detections peaking at over 250 herds nationwide in November. USDA in December announced plans to scale up a bulk milk testing program to pinpoint where the virus exists in order to support rapid implementation of enhanced biosecurity measures to decrease the risk of transmission. Bird flu infections in poultry houses reached their highest level at over 200 million birds in just 1 month during March of 2022. But as you can see on this chart, detections spiked again in December 2023 and December of 2024. Throughout 2024, about 40 million birds were depopulated due to the virus, creating significant losses for poultry producers and higher prices for consumers. USDA is tightening eligibility rules for poultry operations seeking compensation for depopulating infected flocks. A rule issued at the end of December requires farmers to undergo a biosecurity audit before restocking their poultry after an HPAI detection and before receiving future indemnity payments. The virus can be spread through the movement of animals, people, vehicles, and equipment, which experts say makes biosecurity even more important to control outbreaks. Read more about the bird flu and Noah Wicks and Steve Davies' story on agri-pulse.com. For Agri-Pulse, I'm Lydia Johnson.
Weeds, razor-thin margins, supply chain disruptions. American farmers need innovative solutions to tackle the threats that impact us all. Their yield is their livelihood and the food that feeds our families. That shouldn't be on the line, which is why the Modern Ag Alliance advocates for access to essential crop protection tools like glyphosate to keep the future of farming in secure, hard-working hands. Get the facts and see what could be at risk.
Regenerative poultry production is a process by which nature can actually recapture and restore the energy that is being taken out of a space.
Farm Credit helped Rehi build his dream of regenerative poultry farming and encouraging fellow immigrants to find community in agriculture.
Nothing beats a farm. I'm just pursuing happiness.
Learn more at farmcredit.com/beginning.
Don't miss the must-attend policy event of the year. Register now for the 2025 Agri-Pulse Ag and Food Policy Summit. Hear from the diverse players who are trying to navigate taxes, trade, and technology as we dive into what's ahead for food and agriculture. The summit takes place on Monday, March 17th at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and through our virtual experience. View the agenda and register today under the Events tab at agripulse.com.
Welcome back to Agri-Pulse Newsmakers, where this week's panel is going to focus on everything trade. We're joined this week by Phil Karsting with OFW Law and Sharon Bomer Lauritsen from AgTrade Strategies. Thank you both for joining us this morning. And Sharon, I want to start with you first, ma'am. You know, President-elect Trump insisted this week that he's moving ahead with imposing across-the-board tariffs on imports. This after the Washington Post reported his aides are planning something much more modest. What do you make of this?
Well, in my experience, having worked at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative in the first Trump administration, is that, yes, we do need to take it seriously. He does say what he means, particularly when it comes to tariffs. I think the real question is, what is the legal authority for applying tariffs beyond our international trade obligations to all countries on all products? If it were country specific or product specific, you could probably come up with some plausible legal authorities related to national security or an international emergency. But I do think it's difficult to have all tariffs on all imports applied across the board under our current laws.
And I would like to get both of your guys' thoughts on the next question. Phil, we'll go ahead and start with you first, sir. Should farmers be concerned about President-elect Trump's tariff threats leading to another trade war?
Well, I think they definitely should. And let me just start by saying that a wise person will listen to what Sharon Bomer Lauritsen has to say about ag trade, as I did when I was FAS administrator, because she's usually on the money. I'm concerned about it not only from the tariffs that we would put on products coming into this country, a lot of which are, in an ag perspective, are agricultural inputs, whether it's fertilizer, feed ingredients, animal pharmaceuticals. There's going to be some upward pressure if those tariffs really disrupt those value chains. And then, of course, the retaliatory tariffs that would face our producers. You know, we've got folks who export an enormous amount of everything from soybeans to pistachios. And I think people who rely a great deal on export markets need to be very cognizant of that.
And Sharon, your thoughts as well, ma'am?
Yeah, and I agree with Phil. As of now, the president-elect has identified 3 major approaches to imposing tariffs. One is on China, 10% tariffs on day one, and then over at some other point in time, 50 to 60% tariffs on imports of China. And in the last trade war, the United States our farmers and our exporters lost a huge amount of market share in China, now our third top export market. So when we have not regained that market share. The second is Mexico and Canada, 2 countries that are free trade partners with us. And the threat is over non-economic issues, over fentanyl, obviously a problem, and illegal immigration concerns. And then the third, as we talked about before, are the across-the-board tariffs of 10 to 20% on all products, all countries, which I still have concerns about legal authority on.
We'll be back with more of our panel discussion right after this.
I think some of sustainability to farmers just comes second nature. If you asked a farmer, are you sustainable? They'd probably look at you maybe a little funny and say, I don't think I'm doing anything that special, but it really is just what they do. We're all farmers, and our goal is taking the best care of our land, our cattle, our natural resources.
This is my sustainability story.
Weeds, razor-thin margins, supply chain disruptions. American farmers need innovative solutions to tackle the threats that impact us all. Their yield is their livelihood and the food that feeds our families. That shouldn't be on the line, which is why the Modern Ag Alliance advocates for access to essential crop protection tools like glyphosate to keep the future of farming in secure, hard-working hands. Get the facts and see what could be at risk.
Don't miss the must-attend policy event of the year. Register now for the 2025 Agri-Pulse Ag and Food Policy Summit. Hear from the diverse players who are trying to navigate taxes, trade, and technology as we dive into what's ahead for food and agriculture. The summit takes place on Monday, March 17th at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and through our virtual experience. View the agenda and register today under the Events tab at agripulse.com.
Welcome back. Farm groups have been frustrated that the Biden administration hasn't tried to negotiate new free trade agreements. We asked Phil Karsting and Sharon Bomer Lauritsen where a Trump administration could make progress on that front.
Well, I would hope that they would focus on some other markets. I mean, we've got a lot of eggs in the China, Canada, Mexico basket right now as far as ag trade is concerned. And what we've seen in the Biden administration, they did put some additional resources into regional ag promotion programs. I would hope that they would continue that and continue to realize that it serves farmers' best interest if we diversify our export destinations.
Sharon, your thoughts as well, ma'am?
Sure. In the first Trump administration, we actually did start negotiations with both the United Kingdom and Kenya for free trade agreements. We obviously didn't finish those before the change in administration. So while I don't think a new Trump administration will necessarily right off the bat pursue free trade agreements with other countries, I do think that maybe, in a couple of years, working with Congress, because there's still support in Congress for free trade agreements, as we saw with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, I think there is an opportunity that they could pursue trade agreements. I think the question will be what would be the leading countries, and I think that's where U.S. agriculture groups can have a lot of influence identifying some of the key countries that they would like to have a free trade agreement with to expand our exports.
One last question for you guys before we go. Phil, starting with you first again. So you know, economists, now Elon Musk, warning about coming population declines for some markets that are critical for United States agricultural exports. Is this something that farmers and policymakers should be concerned about as they do some long-term planning?
I think you hit it right on the head there when you said long-term planning, because that really is an issue that will play out over much further horizon. And it does argue, I think, for making sure that we diversify our markets in places where that we haven't been before. Unfortunately, a lot of those aren't very wealthy countries, and so we need to figure out a way to crack that nut. I would think a more pressing, immediate issue to be concerned about is sort of the direction they take on inputs, modern inputs to American agriculture. What happens to our productive capacity? We've got a nominee to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, won't have direct control over USDA, but will presumably, if confirmed, have a seat at the table when they talk about in the interagency about issues that affect our trade. Maximum residue levels. He views a much more European-centric approach to that. What's going to happen to products of new technology, GMOs, CRISPR, and the use of fertilizer? Is it going to be sort of like the farm to fork situation that Europe tried? So I think we've got that's a longer term issue, but we will likely have a lot more issues before that comes to the head.
Yeah, as always, I tend to agree with Phil. I think I'll just add on that even though we'll see declining populations in certain countries that are important markets for U.S. agriculture, there are other regions of the world with increasing populations. And I think of the African continent in particular, as well as Southeast Asia. Both of those can be particularly attractive markets for U.S. agricultural exporters. As Phil said, particularly a lot of African countries are developing countries. And that's why I think the money that the Biden administration has put into export promotion will be particularly important for that long-term planning and trying to start opening up those markets and building them.
Certainly a lot to be looking forward to on the trade front as we move into the next Trump administration. Phil, Sharon, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
We'll be right back with more Agri-Pulse Newsmakers, but first, Lydia Johnson has a look at H-2A visa certifications by state in this week's Map It Out.
Seasonal agriculture H-2A visa certifications grew in fiscal year 2024 by less than 2% for the second year in a row. Positions certified have quadrupled from the under 90,000 positions certified in 2012, with 9 of the last 13 years seeing double-digit growth rates. Nationwide, 384,900 H-2A positions were certified in fiscal year 2024. As you can see on this chart, nearly half of all H-2A positions certified were for work in 5 states, as seen in variations of dark green: California, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and Washington. Only about 1/3 of all H-2A positions were for work in states outside of the top 10 states. 16 states reduced their use of the H-2A program in fiscal year 2024, including Florida, California, and Michigan, 3 of the top 10 H-2A states. Rising costs and added regulations have slowed the H-2A program's explosive growth over the last decade. Continuous growth reflects a shift in the domestic workforce away from agriculture, despite a continued need for reliable farm labor. For Agri-Pulse, I'm Lydia Johnson.
Elevate your game and set your sights on Denver for the 2025 Commodity Classic with technology that moves faster than fluctuating markets and information as important as $1 million rain. Commodity Classic is designed for growers of all kinds, where you'll broaden your horizons as you improve yield and ROI 1 bushel at a time. Take your operation to new heights and join us for Elevating Excellence in Agriculture, March 2nd through 4th in Denver. Learn more at commodityclassic.com.
Looking closer, seeing further. That's how we do it. At Curious Plot, we're driven to find what's next for agriculture, animal care, and food. We stay curious because that's what it takes to grow understanding. That's how we plot strategies and tell stories that get results time after time. Marketing, communications, and consulting that look closer and see further. Curious Plot. We can't wait to help you tell your story.
Thanks for joining us on this week's Newsmakers. Here's what's on the horizon for next week. The next Consumer Price Index will be released Wednesday, and we'll have the latest on the confirmation process for President-elect Donald Trump's cabinet appointees, including his pick for Ag Secretary Brooke Rollins and EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin on our website, agripulse.com. For Agri-Pulse Newsmakers, I'm Andrew Hunnicky. Thanks for watching.
Newsmakers is a production of Agri-Pulse Communications. You can also find our new content on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to follow Agri-Pulse and our correspondents on social media to get breaking news and more. For agriculture, trade, food, environment, and regulatory news, your source is agripulse.com.